Hey everyone, Ray Del Vecchio here, and this is going to be the September video for the Nutrition News Roundup. And I came across a lot of good articles this month. I actually had to cut it down. I think I'm going to feature either 5 or 6 articles here. I came across at least 10 to 15 that were worthy of being included, but I wanted to pick the ones that I believe are the most popular and the biggest issues. So the first one is something that everyone's interested in, and that is, what do people eat in a day? Now, I've written about this a few times on my blog since I tracked what I ate for about 6 months. I have about 6 months worth of eating logs, and if you guys are interested in that, let me know in the comments below, because I plan on doing more blog posts, but I know that's something that people always ask. So if you're interested in getting all of them, I'd like to see if there's some demand for that. But the one that I'm going to feature today is from an article from an endurance athlete, and it pretty much just says that the keto diet is becoming popular for endurance athletes and soldiers so they can access fat in survival situations or in athletic competitions where they require a lot of stamina as opposed to just pure strength. So this guy eats about 2,800 calories a day, and he says he eats 80% from fat, 12 from protein, and 8% from carbohydrates. So that's a little bit more than what I was aiming for. I was going for about 70% fat, 20% protein, and 10% carbs. And I strayed from that on a lot of days. I mean, I went up to 20% carbs on certain days. Some days I limited my calories. Other days I limited my carbs to under 10 grams net carbs, which was probably like 5% of my total calorie intake. You can see there's variation between this. So anyways, this guy eats eggs every day for breakfast, but he changes his protein sources for lunch and dinner, swapping in chicken, duck, and occasionally lamb. So I do the same thing. I probably eat beef the most because I like burgers and I like steaks. I mean, who doesn't? But on top of that, when I feel like I'm eating too much beef, I mix it up with chicken, with pork. I need to throw in fish more. And I have gotten ground lamb. I haven't gotten like lamb chops or a cut of lamb anytime recently that I can think of. But I do like mixing up my protein. I like mixing up vegetables, even though the two that I eat the most are probably broccoli and Brussels sprouts. But anyways, he says he recommends to do keto in phases. For 6 to 8 weeks before an event, he's strict, measuring his ketone levels 3 times a week and keeping his carbohydrate intake below 50 grams per day. And I'm assuming that's total, not net. And he says during the off season, he's more laid back. After a strict phase of keto, you're adapted, and it takes almost as long for your body to go back to burning glucose as fuel. So I guess he knows this through his own ketone testing, which I do every now and then, but I don't want to pay, it's $3 per strip, per test strip. So I really don't want to pay that daily. I would love to test daily, but I'm not willing to pay $90 to $100 a month just to test my ketones. But that's pretty nice that he's saying it takes your body a little bit of time to adapt back to burning glucose. So that means if you're on the keto diet, you follow it and you adapt after, say, 2 months, a month. Sometimes it might take a little bit longer. But if you have a bad carb day, it's a lot easier to get back on track. And I've noticed that myself. I mean, I definitely feel crappy after eating a lot of carbs in a day. And in fact, I did that probably about 5 or 6 days ago. I really am motivated to get back on the keto diet after that. So that's pretty, I think that's a big benefit of the keto diet. That's one of the reasons why I've stuck with it for so long. We're almost going on a year now. November is when it's going to be a year for me. So let me continue here. He says he drinks about a gallon of water a day, which I also do, probably about that. And he says he drinks lime-flavored Poland Spring sparkling water, and I don't do that. I just drink plain water. I use Brita filter to filter my tap water, and that's pretty much what I drink 95% of the time. And I use that to make tea and coffee, and those are really the 3 drinks that I drink, I would say, 95 to 100% of the time. Every now and then I'll mix in a diet soda once every like 3 months or 2 months, but I really don't even need that. And he says that most people don't get enough water on keto, which probably does cause some of the keto flu symptoms and other side effects that might cause you to go back to eating carbs and not stick to the diet. But he says when you're ketogenic, especially if you're eating a lot of cheese, water is super important to keep your digestive tract cleaned out. Now, this is interesting to me because I eat a lot of cheese. I've wanted to limit it, but I haven't, mainly because I continue to lose weight eating a lot of cheese. So, and when I say a lot, it's really, I'm chronically eating cheese, meaning like I eat it almost daily. I try not to overdo it any particular day. So I'll have probably about an ounce of cheese a day, maybe an ounce to 2 ounces. On the days where I make like a fathead pizza or a cauliflower pizza, that's a lot more cheese in one day. But I really haven't had like 4 days off where I haven't eaten dairy. I mean, I eat cheese a lot. So, but I'm wondering if maybe it's because I drink a lot of water. I mean, I wonder if maybe you eat cheese and you don't drink enough water. That's a huge factor for people plateauing in terms of their weight loss. So if you really want to see the breakdown of what this guy ate each day, you can go to the article. I'm going to link them all in the description below. So let's move on to the next article. This one was really interesting. This is how the sugar industry shifted blame to fat. And this was published in the New York Times, and I know a few other places. I saw the article on my phone and elsewhere. But I'm just going to go through and read some of these quotes, and then I'll talk about some of it. It says, the sugar industry paid scientists in the 1960s to play down the link between sugar and heart disease and promote saturated fat as the culprit instead. Newly released historical documents show. So the internal sugar industry documents, recently discovered by a researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, and published Monday in an internal medicine journal, it looks like. They suggest that 5 decades of research into the role of nutrition and heart disease, including many of today's dietary recommendations, may have been largely shaped by the sugar industry. Which, after just reading the book, I mentioned it in the last video, I think, How We Got Fat by Gary Taubes. He talks about this, how all the nutrition research over like the last 50 years has pretty much been based on a lot of claims and ideas that might have been false, and we weren't testing the alternate hypothesis that maybe fat isn't bad for you, instead trying to, prove that fat is bad for you, and no studies in 50 years have definitively proven that. So he says, even though the influence peddling revealed in the documents dates back nearly 50 years, more recent reports show that the food industry has continued to influence nutrition science. Last year, an article in the New York Times revealed that Coca-Cola, the world's largest producer of sugary beverages, had provided millions of dollars in funding to researchers who sought to play down the link between sugary drinks and obesity. In June, the Associated Press reported that candy makers were funding studies that claimed that children who eat candy tend to weigh less than those who do not. I mean, this is real studies that are going on. I mean, that's ridiculous that this is still happening. And the reason is because these studies are being funded by these companies and the industry itself. So if you're in an industry as a business, your main goal, especially if you're a big company, your main goal is profit, period. So anything you do is going to be to get more profit and to make more money. You're not going to fund a study that says sugar is bad for you if you're a sugar-based product, because that's going to kill your sales in your company. So this is, and all this stuff gets published, these studies get published to big news outlets, and people believe it. And that's really the root of the problem. I mean, that's part of the reason why I'm doing these nutrition articles, to point out the absurdity of some of this. And let's see, it says, this is the last paragraph I have here in this article. It says, the revelations are important because the debate about the relative harms of sugar and saturated fat continues today. For many decades, health officials encouraged Americans to reduce their fat intake, which led many people to consume low-fat, high-sugar foods that some experts now blame for fueling the obesity crisis, which I totally believe this. And it's funny because I had a teacher back in high school who would always downplay like margarine and all those items that were supposed to be butter. And she would say, I'm just going to use butter. She was overweight, but she was right. She would only eat natural foods, and that's what I believe. All of these foods, all the low-fat foods are processed to take the fat out of them. So would you rather eat a natural food that has fat in it, or a processed food by, man, basically? I don't want to eat that many processed foods or packaged foods. And that's my overall view of diet. So you can read that article yourself. I mean, that's just a ridiculous article. And I don't even want to go into it more than that. But it just shows you that you need to look into some of this stuff yourself and form your own opinions. And don't just, test for yourself. Because a lot of these opinions are general opinions that don't apply to every individual. Your diet is going to be specific to you. So moving on to the next article. This was also a New York Times article, and it says, diabetes in your diet, the low-carb debate. So it says, a few years ago, Richard Kahn, the now retired Chief Scientific and Medical Officer at the American Diabetes Association, was charged with organizing a committee to prescribe a diet plan for people with diabetes. He began by looking at the evidence for different diets, asking which, if any, best controlled diabetes. And this is what he said. When you look at the literature, whoa, it is weak. It is so weak. So, okay, think about that. You're talking about the director, a medical officer of the American Diabetes Association, basically saying that most of the studies done on nutrition are weak. They're not scientifically sound, and they don't prove anything. So that just goes to show you to be skeptical when you read an article about science, about a study. So he says studies tended to be short-term, diets are unsustainable, and differences among them clinically insignificant. The only thing that really seemed to help people with diabetes was weight loss. And for weight loss, there is no magic diet, okay? Now, this is why I'm a proponent of the keto diet. I am smart enough to know that it's probably not the best diet for everybody on earth, but it worked for me, so I'm going to push it and have other people at least test it out for a month or two and see if it's good for them. Because for me, it wasn't just about the weight loss, it was about the sustainability. I think it helped me with my hunger more than any other diet, and that's why, I feel like I have better ability to control the amount I eat with the keto diet versus a carb-heavy diet. And maybe that's a mental thing. Maybe it's certain carb foods, trigger something mentally with me where I overeat them. But I feel like I just get fuller eating protein and fat and limiting my carbs to, a handful of items like green vegetables. I eat a lot of chocolate, so I try and limit that and portion that out. But I eat a lot of chocolate, so I get sugar in the form of chocolate, even though it's 85 or 90% chocolate. But overall, I'm trying to stay under about 50 carbs a day. Some days I go up to 70 to 100. Other days I'm down at 10 or 20. But I try and balance it out at around 50 carbs a day, and that has worked for me. So that's all I can say about that. So he goes on to say, if the goal is to get patients off their medications, including insulin, and resolve rather than just control their diabetes, significant carb restriction is by far the best nutrition plan, said Dr. Sarah Hallberg, so this is somebody else, an osteopath at a weight loss clinic in Indiana. This would include elimination of grains, potatoes, and sugars and all processed foods. There's a significant and ever-growing body of literature that supports this method. So she's obviously a big proponent of severe carb restriction. And, that I think you could do it in phases. You can start with that to get the most dramatic benefit and then slowly adding carbs. Or you could do it the opposite way. You can start with a higher level of carbs and work your way down. Again, this is going to depend on your own habits and, how you are adapted to nutrition and what foods you enjoy. That's everything plays into that. And it says, but there are no large or rigorous studies showing that low-carb diets offer an advantage. And in fact, there is not even a consensus on the definition of low-carb diet. It can vary from doctor to doctor. And that also shows you can have anywhere from 10 carbs a day to 100 to 150, depending on how your body processes them. So even if diets are effective in the short term, the difficulty is adhering to the diet over the long term, as I just mentioned. And in an analysis of weight loss diets, not specifically for diabetics, published this summer, they wrote, diet adherence is so challenging that it is poor, even in short-term studies where all food is provided. When diets are prescribed, adherence is likely to diminish over the long term despite self-reports to the contrary, which I think that points out a few interesting things. Number one, if you're going to self-report and you don't actually track and weigh the amount of food you eat, you're not going to be correct. It's almost impossible to eyeball things unless you track for a long period of time to hone in your ability to estimate the amount of food you're eating. And it just goes on to say that diet adherence is probably the most important factor. You can have the best diet in the world, it might be 0 carbs, but if you don't like that diet, if you're not going to adhere to it, then it's not the best diet for you, even if physically it is the best diet for you. It says, in the short term, the low carbohydrate diet sometimes does better on glycemic control, but as time progresses, the difference mostly disappears. What counts is which diet helps most with long-term weight loss. So this is kind of saying that glucose isn't necessarily the best measure, weight loss is, in terms of long-term glucose control, glycemic control. And I'm testing this in myself. I'm trying to do weekly tests where I eat a certain type of food and test my glycemic response 1 hour and 2 hours after eating. And because of that, I think I'm just uncovering hopefully the foods that my body, is adapted to the best. And on top of that, I'm just testing my glucose fasted in the morning, my fasting glucose, to make sure that that stays at a steady level. And right now, like I said, I'm at my lowest weight in my adult life on keto diet, and my blood sugar to date has been pretty good. So that's why I'm going to continue the keto diet, even though some of these people say that the keto diet isn't sustainable. I believe it is for me, based on my own testing. So I encourage you to do that yourself. And I have to give the disclaimer that I'm not a doctor, and you do this under your own supervision or your doctor's supervision, ideally. All right, moving on to the next article. This one was on bicycling.com, and it was the 5 most crucial carbohydrate questions answered. So I found this interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, because this is geared towards people who obviously bicycle, which means they probably live a more active lifestyle than the average person. And it's more about carbs than it is the keto diet. So I'm kind of interested in both perspectives. Articles on fat, articles on sugar, articles on carbs. So let's just go through this. It says, it's not so much about good or bad carbs. A better way to label carbs would be processed and unprocessed, or minimally processed. The latter choices include whole grains, starchy veggies, fruits, and beans. These are high in fiber and more slowly digested, and since they're minimally processed, they also contain the most nutrients and antioxidants. Highly processed carbs like white bread and baked goods contain little fiber and typically fewer nutrients. These are quickly digested and raise blood sugar fast, which is ideal when you need a quick boost during long rides or runs, but can send you crashing afterwards. And I think, I definitely believe that if you're going to eat carbs, you should eat less processed carbs. And I think it was interesting that how she mentions that processed carbs spike your blood sugar, and that can cause you crashing. And I think just carbs in general, even if you're eating whole carbs, that can still do it if your body isn't necessarily good at digesting or processing those carbs. She goes on to say here that carbs stimulate your body's insulin response if they aren't high in fiber or eaten with foods that contain protein and or fat. The blood sugar increase and decrease tends to be sharp, which can stimulate hunger. Eating a lot of carbs can make you feel less satisfied and more inclined to graze, which again, that's for the average person. I think that is more important to take care of than eating carbs to fuel up. If you're not going to exercise that much, which to me, you can exercise, but I think if you're going to adopt the habit to eat better, not to exercise more, because that's going to have a better effect on your weight loss and your overall lifestyle in general, your energy levels, all that. I think it's a lot harder to exercise when you're eating a crappy diet, and from everything I've read, exercise is not the long-term answer to weight loss. You're going to reach a point where exercise doesn't affect weight loss enough, and over time you need to exercise more and more as you get older, which is not sustainable. So the way to counteract this, in my opinion, is by limiting the amount of carbs you eat until you get to a point where you can control your hunger without needing to mentally portion control. I think she may go on to talk about this, but the next thing I have here is going low carb is not the path to getting lean, although she acknowledges the initial benefits. When you cut carbs, you often cut calories, and that can help with weight loss. Cutting carbs also pulls water out of the cells, which can help you shed even more pounds, yet when you reintroduce carbs, the weight will often come back immediately. The key is to eat the right amount of carbs, especially if you're engaging in a high output activity like cycling. So this is interesting because I definitely believe that if you're doing strength training or something that involves high intensity, then you probably will want more carbs into your diet, and you may even want to eat carbs during exercise if you're doing long periods of exercise that's also high intensity. But she says something here which I'm sure applies more to cyclists than the average person trying to lose weight. But she says that going low carb is not the path to getting lean. When you cut carbs, you often cut calories, and that can help with weight loss. Well, I think the point of going low carb is that you don't have to count calories. And you're not necessarily cutting calories, you're just eating the amount of calories that sustain you, as opposed to going through that blood sugar spike and grazing on carbs, or grazing because you have a lot of carbs in your diet and you feel hungry after you eat a meal when you shouldn't. So, again, I'm taking this with a grain of salt because it's in a bicycling magazine. And she suggests that you should start with 50 to 60% carbs in terms of your calorie composition, 15 to 20% protein, and 25 to 30% fat. So that's actually more fat than I think most people advise. I feel like people might mix it around where they either have equal parts protein and fat or more protein than fat. But she does suggest just adjusting as needed based on your own body, which I like that. And then she goes on to say, recent studies have suggested that burning fat instead of carbs will improve performance because the body's fat reserve is much larger than its glycogen stores, an approach known as ketosis. Yet a 2015 study in the Journal of Applied Physiology found the opposite effect. Muscles rely more on carbs as their fuel source during prolonged exercise. In fact, the researchers found carbs contribute to up to 91% of the energy used by runners. Fat might make great fuel if you're willing to commit to switching your body into ketosis, but for the average athlete, carbs are the most convenient way to go. So I think, I didn't look at the article that she referenced in here, or the journal article, but my guess is that when she says 91% of the energy used by runners is carbs, that's probably because they're not fat adapted, which she kind of mentioned. You have to get fat adapted, which means you have to follow the keto diet for probably a month or two before your body is actually burning fat at an optimal level. It takes a little bit of time for your body to upregulate the burning of fat for energy. But she mentioned something interesting. The first line of this says that studies have suggested that burning fat instead of carbs improves performance because the body's fat reserve is much larger than its glycogen stores. And that's exactly true. You have about 10 times the amount of fat, an order of magnitude more, on your body to use as fuel than you do carbs stored in your muscles or your liver. So you basically only have about a day's worth of energy stored in your muscles and your liver, whereas you have obviously months worth of fat, or maybe weeks, but if you're heavier, you have months worth of fat, excuse me. So that's kind of the whole point of doing the keto diet, that you're accessing your body's energy reserve, that you have a lot more energy compared to what's stored in your muscles. Now, again, what has to be considered is that to do heavy, high intensity exercise and strength training, your body does need carbs. It's harder to get that energy from fat if you're doing that high strength training. But if you're doing low intensity to mid intensity exercise, like we mentioned in the first article, endurance athletes, ketosis and eating a high fat diet is probably a good answer, or at least something you might want to test to see if it works for you. And the last article here was on Thrillist.com. It says how to eat carbs and not gain weight. So I found this kind of interesting because there was a few things in here that I disagree with, and also a few things that a few methods to reduce the damage from carbs that I actually do. So the first thing that I disagree with here, it says, actually, it's pretty silly to deprive yourself of this important food group, meaning carbohydrates. For starters, there's only one of 3 macronutrients, the others being protein and fat, which means cutting carbs out throws your whole balanced diet out of whack, and your body needs them to, function. It actually kind of says that in like a sarcastic way. Once again, well, let me read the next line here because it'll kind of put it all together. It says, this is a quote from a registered dietitian who says, 90% of the brain's fuel is glucose, so we need carbs in order to not only think straight, but to perform. Also, carbohydrates give us energy. They provide glucose, and we burn glycogen, which is our tank for fuel in the body. So this touches on a couple things. First of all, I think this is kind of like a chicken or egg issue, where it says we need carbs because 90% of the brain's fuel is glucose. But 90% of the brain's fuel is glucose because we're eating carbs. When you eat fat, your body starts using ketones, your brain starts using ketones, and a lot of people actually have the opposite results of what this guy's talking about, which is, it says you need carbs and glucose to think straight. Well, people say that the keto diet actually gives you clearer thinking. And I think it's more just because of the steady energy than anything, but also because I believe your body at the cell level uses oxygen more efficiently, I think, when you have ketones in your body, like flooding throughout your bloodstream. And I think it's good for your brain too. I mean, your brain is made of fat. So they want to talk about how your brain's fuel is glucose. Well, your brain is made of mostly fat. So that's also another thing to consider. And the other thing I wanted to touch on was she mentions how, cutting out carbs throws out the idea of a balanced diet and your body needs them to, function. Well, the question that I would respond with is, are there any essential carbs? And the answer to that is no. There's essential proteins and there's essential fats, but there's no essential carbs. So you can actually survive and function without carbs. You can perform optimally without carbs. And there is no consensus. As we just talked about, nutrition articles and studies are so varied and not scientifically sound that there's no consensus to what a balanced diet is. It's easy to say a balanced diet is an equal portion or, getting a little bit of each macronutrient, but that hasn't been scientifically proven. So there's no proof to that statement, even though it's kind of stated as a fact. Now, one thing I do agree with here, it says, after a tough workout is an ideal time to get in the majority of your carbs for the day, especially if you're nervous about eating them. And this is kind of something that mentally has taken away my nerves of eating carbs. I try and fit it in exactly according to this recommendation. Usually I do it either after I fast for a long period of time, I usually eat carbs and then I'll fast, maybe intermittent fasting for a couple days, or I'll do this where I work out a little bit harder than normal and then I'll eat carbs afterwards, because I've heard this, I don't know much about the bodybuilding world, but I've heard from a few people that there's something called the anabolic window, where after you eat or after you exercise heavily, if you eat within 1 to 2 hours after that exercise, the carbs normally go to replenish your muscles as opposed to getting stored as fat. And your body's a little more sensitive to taking in those carbs into the muscles. So this is exactly what I do. If I'm going to eat a lot of carbs in a day, I do it after a workout. And he says by dinner time, he usually urges people to stick to a small serving unless you're really craving something starchy, which I don't think you should give into a craving, because craving something starchy doesn't necessarily mean you need it. It could just be a craving, and the effect of blood sugar rising and falling because you're eating a carb-heavy diet. So I don't agree with that first part of the statement. But he says, I see a lot of people skip out on their carbohydrates for dinner, and they're starving, and they end up going binging on a bunch of stuff that they shouldn't. So he's saying basically if you skip carbohydrates over a long period of time, you might binge. And this is also something I agree with, which is why I had to cut him out, because I couldn't sustain the diet of eating a few amount of carbs, because that would always lead to eating more carbs for me. And the last statement here, which we're going to finish off with, it says, at the end of the day, it's all about calories. So if you're planning on indulging in something particularly carb heavy, he recommends trimming them from the rest of your macros or calories for the day. Now, going back to the book, Why We Got Fat by Gary Taubes, that entire book is to disregard the notion or not disregard, but at least say maybe it's possible that calories aren't the be-all, end-all. His hypothesis is that eating more fat affects your hormones positively, where you just naturally manage the calories you eat better. And if you eat too many carbs, your hormones get out of whack and your hunger gets out of whack, and that causes you to overeat. So this needs to be studied. I think it's obvious that there's a lot of competing theories that people have here, especially doctors, researchers, nutritionists, writers on these health sites or any website that writes about dieting in any way. So if there's one thing you take away from this video here, it's that just read this stuff, know it, and test yourself and figure out what works for you. I'm very passionate about what works for me and defending that because it worked for me. And I'm like I said, I'm intelligent enough to realize that it might not work for you. I'm not saying it's going to work for you, but I suggest that you experiment a little bit to test your diet over 1, 2, 3 months. Like I said, because your body takes time to adapt to the keto diet. So give it 2 to 3 months, test it. If it doesn't work, you can test something else, another diet that might be more sustainable for you. Just make sure you're doing this testing individually, and again, with the supervision of a doctor, ideally, to see what works best for your weight loss, your blood sugar control, and your overall health. Now, if you're interested in the keto diet and trying it, I put together a 7-day meal plan to make it easy for you to get started. That comes with a shopping list, recipes, and a lot of them are really easy to prepare. So you're not going to spend that much time in the kitchen. You could do some of these in bulk if you want to freeze some or just eat the same meals a couple times throughout the week, which is what I do. You can go to my website, ketodietresults.com, and download that, which I'll link to that here. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and comment below. I love to discuss either your thoughts on some of these articles or your experience on the keto diet. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great day.